biomedical challenge that we are facing right now in the world. And so what we're in the middle of right now, somewhere in 2025, is an unprecedented period of human history, where I'm showing you in the blue bars the number of individuals between the age of 65 and 84. And in this 4-decade period of time, that number is doubling. And interestingly enough, the number of 85-year-olds is actually quadrupling. So this is unprecedented in human history. And this is great. We all want to live long, but we want to live healthy. And so the problem of just being older is it puts you at an ever increasing risk of all sorts of chronic diseases. So you can see right here, right beyond 65, you're already in this steep curve where the risk of all these diseases go up in suite. And here's the males who do worse, females here, and the average. So why is this happening? Well, it's actually a success story. So we have done such good work in biomedicine that when you look at history in 1900s, this is the number of deaths by age group. And so there were a lot of infant deaths, even midlife deaths, and people did not live beyond their 70s very often. Now we completely change this curve where there's very little death until you get out into your 70s, 80s, 90s. And so this is great. We can look forward to living longer. But this group of individuals now is in a period that Jay Olshansky called the red zone. So this is a period of increasing more, all of those diseases piling on cumulatively. So if you look at this in another graphical representation, now this is the number of, or the fraction of individuals with no disease, up to 8 diseases as you get in the blue zone in this slide. So I've just put a couple of bars here to show beyond 65 to 69, half of the individuals will have 2 or more diseases, whereas a quarter of them will have 3 or more diseases. And by the time you look at these 85-year-olds who are quadrupling in number, they will have, the majority will have 2 or more diseases. So this really led to the notion, if we put all of our eggs in one basket and tried to cure Alzheimer's or cancer, that's great, but it's really not going to make for a healthier population, because now you're going to take away Alzheimer's, but there's a good chance they will have diabetes or other diseases. The other thing that we've been very successful at is turning many lethal diseases like HIV into chronic diseases. So this is true for a lot of genetic diseases, HIV, diabetes. Patients are doing much better. We've metabolic syndrome, and patients with transplantation, organ transplantation, they're all doing better, but they're actually aging faster than normal because of the disease process and then the treatment they have to go through. So not only do we have an older population, but we have more people who have been through chronic diseases that are aging rapidly too. So this led to the notion of geroscience, which is a radically new approach, where the whole idea is we want to develop ways that we can treat pharmacologically target fundamental aging biology. So all the things that go wrong as you age that puts you at high risk of disease. And the thought is this would have a greater impact on human health than curing any one single chronic. And this is intended to have one intervention that would prevent or alleviate multiple diseases at once. This would prevent you from having 6 different kinds of ologists in your life to take care of individual organ systems. It would also reduce the risk of polypharmacy, so being prescribed multiple different drugs by different doctors who never really speak to one another. And of course, this would have huge impact on healthcare costs. So the goal of geroscience is illustrated in this graph. And so what I'm trying to illustrate is, as you get older, deeper into your lifespan, your fitness is great for a period of time, but there's this slow decline. The slope is what we're not happy with. And so this is when you're accumulating more and more diseases. So with geroscience, what we're hoping to do is change the shape of this curve. So you stay very fit, very active, very independent. And then there's a quicker avenue to death at that point. And so the point is to compress the period of decline, not necessarily make people live longer, but just improve quality of life by making you healthier. And I believe this is possible based on a couple of things I'll show you. One is just genetics. So if you think about aging like this woman who's trapped at home, hooked up to an oxygen machine, checking her blood glucose, or I want to age like her, or she's out and about, she has a great budget for her wardrobe, she's giving away money, she's just really enjoying life. And sure enough, it turns out that centenarians, which is, runs in families, clearly genetic, they enjoy 20 plus more years of disease-free survival compared to the average population. And what's really remarkable is in the last 2 years of their life, they actually spend 2.5 times less in healthcare. So they're not going to the doctor, they're not going to the ER, they're not on a lot of medications. So that's what we're hoping to do. And I would say because we have these examples of centenarians, biologically, we are rigged to make this possible. The other thing is, this is a very interesting, I don't know if you've heard of metformin. It's also called glucophage. It's used to treat diabetes or pre-diabetes, but it turns out to be a wonder drug. So we have been using metformin in people 60, and somebody was clever enough to assemble the health data from those hundreds of thousands of people have been on metformin, are a diabetic and taking something other than metformin, your survival curve is not very good. That's a pretty steep decline here. And that's compared to, in black, the non-diabetic controls. However, if you look at diabetics on metformin, they actually outlive their controls. So green versus red curves. And when you look at this, not only is their diabetes under control, but they have less cancer, later onset heart disease, and they have later onset cognitive decline. So this is one drug we have in our arsenal that is already working like a geroscience drug. It's targeting multiple chronic diseases with one pill. And this is another work by Jay Oshansky, where who's a brilliant epidemiologist in this space. So he graphed this as the millions of people who would remain healthy now as we go out into the future. If we delayed or cured cancer, that curve would not shift that much because again, people are going to have a second disease, or the majority of them will. If you cured heart disease, it would be the same thing. Sorry, this graph is not working. Heart disease is in green, and then purple is if you actually found a geroscience drug and slowed the aging biology itself that underlies all these diseases. It would have a huge impact, and the number is up to $38 trillion in savings in healthcare costs in our country alone. So it's really pretty enormous. So that's kind of setting the stage for what MyBAM and the research at the University of Minnesota on healthy aging is about. I could tell you more about our institute, or we could just brainstorm on this if you like. Any thoughts?
When you're talking about the savings on medical costs and the $38 trillion, there's also costs related to like public the pensions and things like that. So are there any comparisons on their net savings, or are you going to have? I mean, obviously, you're going to have escalating costs in in other areas too, if people are living healthier, living longer.
It's a great point, but the notion is if you're healthier, you're actually contributing to the economy. So there's that savings as well. You're active, I think they say that baby boomers are holding $14 trillion worth of assets right now. And if they're active and traveling and doing all sorts of things, it could contribute to the economy.
Are you drawing any conclusions about whether people should be taking some kind of a drug as they age, or is it just diabetics that are taking that, and so the study relates only to their longevity?
No, it really, we now have, I think, upwards of 40 clinical trials ongoing to test these gerotherapeutics, some of which are just natural products and available over the counter, but they've been shown to be biologically active, slow aging in all the right preclinical models to justify a clinical trial. And they're in study for frailty, for osteoporosis, for pulmonary fibrosis, chronic kidney disease, Alzheimer's disease. So we're trying them in all the existing chronic diseases of old age. What we do is try ultimately to test the question, if we give it to you at the time of your first chronic disease, can we prevent you from getting any others? And that would really prove the point that we are extending healthy aging. But that's just not realistic in the United States right now because the FDA says you have to drug a disease. So we're going at this a little bit piecemeal. But there is certainly evidence of benefit in many different diseases.
Do you run the risk that people are going to look at pharmaceuticals instead of, diet and exercise?
That is a great question too. And I came from Florida to Minnesota, and I learned that Minnesotans don't like to take pills. They'd rather go get exercise and do it. In Florida, they just want the pill. Don't bother me. So it's a mixture. And this is also to help people who, because of arthritis or obesity, might be challenged in getting enough exercise to stay healthy. But the hope is if you kept people kind of fit, but then you have a blood test, say, okay, you are showing biomarkers of unhealthy aging. Now is time for an intervention. I think these could augment a good lifestyle.
Okay.
Is there a therapeutic level of the metformin that you're looking at?
Yes, it's the same dose. So again, this is just reanalysis of those who are taking metformin to control their diabetes. So it's the standard dose that a diabetic would take.
Thank you. I'd love to know more about your institute.
Okay, happy to share. Uh-oh. Sorry, I have to go. So we are now called MyBAM. But the way the way our institute was started is the state of Minnesota came to the university and said, we have a good budget this year, and we would like the university to pick out 4 areas that we think are going to be very challenging in the coming decade. So this started in 2015, and the 4 programs that were requested for financial support from the state were addiction, rural health, and optical brain imaging, as well as the biology of aging. So our aging Minnesotan population. And I should point out that one other thing that's happening with demographics is that the number of individuals under 18 is now eclipsed by the number of people who are over 65. And that has a really dramatic impact on the labor workforce. So again, very important to keep people healthy in old age because we won't have the caregivers is what it's boiling down to. So the state of Minnesota pledged money for 10 years do each of these programs. And my husband and I joined the University of Minnesota in 2018 to lead the Biology of Aging program. And then we were given a generous gift from the Masons. So instead of being called IBAM, we're now MyBAM. But our mission really is to improve the health and the quality of life for those in the state of Minnesota. And from what we learn, we can apply that more broadly. So we're really doing this in a four-pronged approach where we're studying very fundamental mechanisms of aging biology. We're very, very good at drug development. So we have many new drugs and patents. We are also working with all of our clinicians at the University of Minnesota because it's a very rich clinical environment, as well as really focusing on educating more geroscience scientists for the future. So my husband and I, we lead the MyBAM. We just added another director, Doug Mashek, who's an absolute expert in metabolism. And it's turning out that how we handle lipid and our metabolism is very, very important for how well you age. And then we've got faculty members with expertise in immunology, bioinformatics, and handling large data, as well as doing single cell experiments, which is very, very cutting edge. C. elegans is a little worm that's too small to see by naked eye, but is the workhorse of studying genetics of aging. So Matt Gill is an expert in that. Ming Zhu, also an expert in metabolism and developing drugs. And then Xavier Revelos, who's very well versed in physiology of heart and liver. So we've handpicked this crew to really cover all of the aspects of aging biology. And we work beautifully together and have a number of grants. So we've been able to raise $90 million in funding from NIH. Of course, that's covering many, many years. So some of the accomplishments are that we've trained 23 postdocs and 32 graduate students, plus over 100 undergraduates, trying to get them excited about aging biology and thinking about our older population. We have lots of grants from NIH to support these training activities. We publish in the top tier journals and are often invited to review these topics for the top journals. And just the last couple of years, we got $19 million worth of new grants. So we are fortunate to have funding from 5 NIH institutes, several foundations that support aging research. Several companies have been attracted to the University of Minnesota. So it's a diversified portfolio. So so far this year, we've had a budget of about $9 million, which has helped. We are connected globally, so we are involved with groups in Europe, Saudi Arabia, all over the United States, trying to keep our eye very much on the forefront of what's going on in aging research. And quite honestly, we're decision makers for many of the academies. We created an alliance where we exchange students and again have a lot of basis for clinical trials and research. We created the Translational Geroscience Network. So this is the infrastructure across 8 universities in the United States to actually run clinical trials to test our new drugs. And we're very fortunate to have both Mayo and University of Minnesota involved in that in our state. And we created the Midwest Aging Consortium because a lot of people think all the science in the world happens on the East or the West Coast, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So this is a very strong organization. And what we're really excited about is the Dean of the School of Medicine has created a rural clinical trial network. And you can find out more information about this, but we really want to be able to reach all corners of the state and offer clinical studies both on the aging biology as well as setting up for interventional trials if there are individuals we find at risk for multiple diseases of old age. We think that doing this in the state of Minnesota will provide a template for how to expand this globally. So we have, these are the global partners of the University of Minnesota, where we could deploy some of this knowledge once we master things here in the state of Minnesota. So in brief, that is what we are up to.
Could I ask a question about, and I know it's not the research part of it, but it's dependent on the research part of it. I had an opportunity to meet Earl Bakken, who started Medtronic way back when, and he's deceased now. But when I think about the research at the University of Minnesota that basically led to the biomedical industry in Minnesota, and I don't think people have a good grasp of what the economic impact of that is, and I'm not even sure I do, but the fact of the matter is, we've got more employees in the biomedical, which is the technology, the tech side of it, devices, than any state other than California in sheer numbers. In California, I don't know what it is, but 8, 10 times bigger than Minnesota. We're number 2 in the country on sheer numbers of people employed in that area. Do you think that this is an area where we could get that type of an economic impact if we invested in this and worked in this?
That is a
not
great
opportunities
question.
there?
Yeah, great question. I do. So realistically, this idea is not de-risked enough for big pharma quite yet. So we're doing this very much grassroots, largely out of academia. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity. One would be with some of these proprietary drugs that we've developed at the University of Minnesota. If we can get those licensed and then bring the investors to the state of Minnesota, which we'd want to do, then I think that would be kind of a seed for just expanding this dramatically. I think there's a great opportunity for interacting with the technology industry. Devices are going to be very important for people, keeping people healthy and safe, and monitoring, all sorts of aspects of your physiology, as people are doing already with their Fitbits and their Oura rings. So that would be another opportunity. The other thing that's very unique to Minnesota is all of the agriculture. And so I think there's opportunities for thinking about supplements to food eventually. And it's just figuring out which is the fastest course to really attract investors, so that Minneapolis, Minnesota is a home for this kind of work.
And I'm sorry, I didn't want to derail the conversation in that direction, but it did strike me that there's a opportunity here that ought not to be lost on the people who are sitting around this table. And
There is an incredible opportunity, and just getting the right people in the right room to figure out the quickest way to execute some of this is really been tricky. There's appetite for this, I think. The Vice Research held a forum when he first arrived at the University of Minnesota and invited Honeywell and all sorts of businesses and many of the biotech that are local. And it seemed like everybody agreed that tackling aging is really an important issue for the state of Minnesota. And we're just doing a small part of it because it's, the biomedical part. But I think infrastructure, transportation, housing, there's a lot to do. This is going to be a pretty dramatic change in our society. Other thoughts from anybody?
Do you have any thoughts about what the next great breakthrough is going to be?
It's a good question. So in particular, we are focused at the University of Minnesota on a class of drugs called senolytics. So we developed them starting before we got to the University of Minnesota, and we've continued on that route. What these drugs do is they selectively clear out damaged cells that we all accumulate as we get older. And those cells drive chronic inflammation in the. So if you get rid of them, you just kind of lower your inflammation and you lower your risk for disease. And anything you have going on, creaky knees, or they all get better miraculously on these senolytics. So they are now in clinical trials, and I think there's going to be a big impact. This is a completely, so for example, they're in clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease. And if that works, it's a completely new approach. We're not talking about amyloid or tau or anything. We're talking about a completely different approach to treating Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, cancers. So I'm very optimistic about that. What we're also seeing is because of the fact that we're already in the midst of our population aging, we're also trying to repurpose existing drugs for this application. So that's why we talk about metformin, rapamycin, some other existing drugs that have been put into people. They're very safe and they could be applied. So I don't know in that race which is going to come first, an already approved safe drug like metformin that's more widely tested and then implemented, or if it's going to be this whole new class of drugs, senolytics. But I am cautiously optimistic within 10 years, this is going to be that we actually have therapeutics for aging biology. As just a support of the notion that senescent cells and drugs that target them, called senolytics, are in the National Institute of Health. Sorry, my internet is poor. I'm sorry about that. But NIH invested close to $200 million in mapping where senescent cells occur in your body as you get older and developing biomarkers for them. So we could say, oh, Laura, you have more senescent cells than you should for somebody your age. You need a senolytic. So the government set aside $200 million to study this. And we are in the midst of that funding period right now, and the University of Minnesota and Mayo Clinic are running this effort. So it just illustrates that we really have an opportunity here, a lot of strengths, a lot of talent, and we think a very important problem that has been vetted by NIH and Congress, actually.
I have to ask the inevitable question, is the new thriftiness being expressed at the federal level? How is that going to impact you?
That is a great question. I think the biggest threat that we're hearing, well, let me put it this way. A lot of the damage that's happened already, like to Columbia University and the University of Minnesota is being threatened with this, that's just punitive stuff that, you know, the administration is targeting. This is unprecedented in the world of science, that you target individuals or projects or anything along those lines. Usually you let scientists say, this is my best science. Is it worthy of funding? I think the biggest threat right now is that they have said that grants are going to be reduced in value. And when we apply for a grant, the cost dollars that we get has not changed since 1997. So you can imagine that cutting it further would just be ridiculous. If $1 million in grant money from the federal, the University of Minnesota extra 40,000 just to support infrastructure. So we have what's called an interest rate of 54%. They are threatening to cut that back to 15%. And that would eviscerate science. I think, you know, the University of Minnesota ultimately will figure it out because it's big and has lots of sources for support, lots of opportunity, lots of talent, but many private research institutes will basically disappear overnight. So relatively speaking, we're in a good scale, but it is a very threatening time. There's no doubt. And we worry most of all about young trainees getting scared off. So this could have impact for decades and decades.
Perhaps you spoke to this earlier, but I have found that my serious hearing loss is more of a handicap than some other ailments. Are there any therapeutics for hearing loss?
That is too. There's something that we have not tested yet with these sort of new medicines or new approaches in geroscience. We have not tested it for hearing. I understand that there are ever improving devices, and that might be a better arena. But I think prevention will probably be the most likely approach with some of these therapeutics that slow aging biology. But you're right. I mean, it's a huge loss to quality of life. It's really impactful. What do you guys think? Would you be in favor of thinking about a therapeutic, a drug to take to prevent chronic diseases of old age?
I would. I've been on metformin and I just started Monjero. I want to lose some weight too. So
Great.
and I used to teach fitness and I'm trying to get back into it big time.
That's awesome. And it's true that like we have studies to show that if you are exercising, and it doesn't have to be like heroic exercise, it can be a 20-minute walk or so, you actually lower your amount of senescent cells. And so you can do a lot as, you know, with lifestyle interventions. But realistically, that's all we have right now, unless your doctor is willing to give you metformin.
Is it your center that's working? I heard there was an experiment going on with mice at the University of Minnesota where they're getting longer living, healthier mice. Is that through your center or is that somewhere else?
That is us.
Okay, and tell us about that.
Sure.
Research.
Well, so my claim to fame, so to speak, is I was able to make mice that age 6 times faster than normal. And so this has been a boon for the drug discovery business. So we can test drugs very, very rapidly to see if they improve quality of life, reduce diseases, and lengthen the lifespan of these very acutely aging mice. Then we always go back and test our drugs in mice that are naturally old, but these have to be close to 3 years of age. So those experiments take a much longer time. But we are definitely seeing that some of these interventions will affect 6 or 7 organ systems and make them look healthier and younger. The animals, some of the things we look at is just how is their coat? How is their vision? We don't measure hearing. I wish we could. We measure just spontaneous activity, their willingness to exercise, and some of these drugs really have an impact. And that's what we're focused on more than can we just make an animal live 20% longer, but not be active and healthy and fit. So we've tested metformin and rapamycin. The other thing that we can say works very well is what's called compressed eating. And so this is something everybody can take on if they're willing to. And the idea is you can eat whatever you want in a 24-hour period of time, but try and compress it so that you're only eating in the shortest window that you're willing to accept. So it could be like lunch and dinner, and then you don't eat anything more after 6 o'clock and don't eat until noon the next day. That turns out to be really healthy. And that has been tested in mice and in primates. And there's people who live by this and swear by this. It's easier than caloric restriction. That's no fun.
So is that like intermittent fasting then?
Well,
So
there's
the same thing or
3.
not?
It's not quite, because intermittent fasting would be like, I'm not going to eat at all for 24 hours. Then I'm going to eat the next day. And that's really hard to achieve, really, really hard. So this
Yeah, I like to
compressed
eat.
eating, yeah. But they really showed in primates that, you know, you can see that in an experimental setting. If you only serve food in short periods of time, that had a huge impact on health. And so, yeah, it would just be compressing. So there's intermittent fasting, then compressed eating. So I'm a
Okay.
fan of the latter. Anything else I can tell you about the U or questions, please?
Well, I just really appreciate how you're working on trying to improve the quality of life, because living longer with a horrible quality of life, I think, is like torture.
It is.
So I appreciate the work that you guys are doing, and I hope you are able to share more revelations for us. Because I mean, I have been 29 for 30 years, and yeah, only our children get older, but you know, eventually, whatever.
No, I mean, I went through this with my parents. I lost one to Alzheimer and one to Parkinson's disease. And the other thing that struck me is I spent a lot of time with them. So during my 40s and 50s, I was a caregiver. And if we all have to do that, you know, and then when my mom finally was near the end, she had a staff of 8 people to monitor her around the clock. And we can't do this going forward, right? It's just, we don't have enough bricks and mortar right now to build facility, you know, independent living facilities or anything. So yeah, we're really focused on quality of life, independence, and even these drugs even help with depression, believe it or not. So yeah, keeping people happy, independent, I think that would have a financial benefit for all.
Well, and potentially just age in place at home.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. The other thing that's going on out there is a lot of people are building what's called longevity clinics. So they are popping up left and right. Mayo now has one. I understand it's so popular, they have a waiting list of 750 people. They are now branching out to Florida and their site in Arizona as well. But I have to tell you, this is very experimental right now. Basically, they're measuring things to try and understand how we can say you're aging well or you're not aging well and might need some help. Some of them in Singapore and Korea are giving out medicines. Israel has a very big clinic. They will give out medicines, supplements. They will evaluate your diet, your exercise. They'll do the whole shebang and give you advice, but it's not been proven in clinical trials. So we are very wary of those. And I think the University of Minnesota is going to take the approach that we will do FDA approved clinical trials and that way only, not just willy-nilly start implementing some of these things until we know exactly what to expect and that it's absolutely safe. That's the first priority. So you can read about longevity clinics all over the country.
What's the theory behind a longevity clinic? I mean, what are they just measuring stuff? I mean, it's a little bit like people who weigh themselves every morning. They tend to not get as heavy. And so people who are very active and want to go to longevity clinics, I would think they would tend to live longer because they're really they're focused on it.
That's exactly right. And maybe that's all, right? It's just more attention and people willing to invest time and money. I mean, this is not inexpensive either. And it's not something that you can follow all the advice if you have a very, very active career. It can be quite time consuming to prepare the meals and the nutrients that they want you to prepare. But so yes, I think the placebo effect here is going to be very strong. But what they are doing is measuring things like we have what we call the 12 hallmarks of aging. And they are basically everything that goes wrong in your cells and in your organs universally with aging. And so they try and measure each of these 12 hallmarks and say, oh, well, and one of them is senescent cells. So they might say, oh, you have a lot of senescent cells. We're going to give you a supplement that's supposed to kill senescent cells, senolytic. Or they might say your metabolism is off. You need a supplement of NAD, which is just a metabolite we make in our body, and you can take it as a supplement. So that's what they're trying to do is be scientific, but there's no proof that any of these things will work. It's experimental at this point in time. So the best that you can hope is that if you're very engaged in this process, you will live longer and healthier, as you said.
Could you talk a little bit about the impact of rapidly increased sleep? And if you're looking at that at all in a way that possibly could be changed, or does it make any difference?
Just the quality of sleep?
Quantity of
Quantity, yeah. Sleep is certainly a very important part of this. It's something that unfortunately is not a consistent in quantity or quality as you get older. I don't know a lot of people who are anywhere in the globe that I can think of who are really studying sleep as a way to slow aging. It's just that it's canonical that you need a good night's sleep, you need good nutrition, and you need some exercise. And that's the best we can do until we have some therapeutics. So I'm sorry, not a lot to share in that space.
I went to the doctor this morning and she mentioned that she had been to Mayo for a workshop and that menopause really doesn't impact your weight like we thought it does. That it's more, lack of movement, you're eating too much, you're aging, that it's aging. So I didn't really talk much about it, a lot of time, but are you familiar with that? Do you know anything about that?
I don't know exactly who that scientist is, or what data that they were using to support that claim, but I know this to be kind of the opposite, actually. If you look at like if a pathologist looks at tissues from women at many different ages, you actually see that there's 2 times in a woman's life when they age pretty radically. And that is at the end of fertility and then at menopause. The good news is we were always on a better trajectory than men anyway. So it's not that big of a hit. So yeah, men actually, if you look at pathology, molecular markers, diagnostic tools, they all age more quickly. But unfortunately, women, once we get older, we up and are more prone to more chronic diseases at the very end of life. So I'm not sure. I think there is evidence that menopause has quite an effect on your age.
Thank you.
Can I ask just a curious question in terms of the name of your organization, the
Yes.
center, the institute? You said that the Masonic source of funding came in and they wanted, was it metabolism added in as a phrase, as a term? What's the significance of that?
It's a great question. I honestly, the name of the institute was decided by the state early on, so I didn't have anything to do with the naming of it. I think before Paul and myself came to the University of Minnesota, there was not a focus on aging. So metabolism was added to encompass the scientific strengths that we have at the university. And it turns out to be a very, very important component of aging. So it's been fortunate for us. The Masons added their name to the front of our institute. So we're now the Masonic Institute of Biology of Aging and Metabolism. So they got naming rights. We are fortunate enough to have other donors who are going to support an institute on healthy aging at the University of Minnesota. So we're just getting that started. And that will come with a lot of clinical research, more geriatricians. I think exactly what we need in Minneapolis.
What university were you at prior to coming here?
Prior to this, I was at the Scripps Research Institute. So that's one of those private institutes that will disappear overnight if the federal government really does do as they're threatening to do with the indirect cost rate.
California?
It's in California, but there was a branch in Florida. So I was kind of between the two. And I went there purposely to learn drug development. Prior to that, I started my career at University of Pittsburgh, and I've kind of been all over the place for school and training.
How do you spell those cells that you were talking about? It's Cinefit or something like that, or setalytics?
Yes, I can actually, yeah. So senescence, SEN, and then EN, senescence.
Thank you.
And the drugs are senolytics, meaning lysing senescent cells. So SENOLYTIC, senolytic.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Also drop it in the chat. So you guys are all very active in thinking about where the state is headed and working with legislators.
Group is made up, consists totally of former legislators and current legislators. You have to be one or the other in order to get into the organization. And I would say you have a lot of people that in the organization that's interested in public policy, generally speaking.
Fantastic.
Aspects of it.
Fantastic.
But this is the first discussion we've had on aging, I think.
And anomaly, I was married to a legislator, but I was a lot.
Okay, great. Well, I really appreciate your service. I think it's so important. And I do think this is a very impactful area. And so if there's anything ever I can provide you in terms of information or support documentation, I'd be more than happy to do that. We are always available. And we are working even at the federal government level, trying to always support science and actually to really support gero science research. So I'm on the advisory group for a lobby group back in Washington that's really pushing for more attention just because of our changing demographics.
Have you ever been invited before a legislative committee in Minnesota?
I went briefly just a couple of weeks ago because the way our institute is funded is a line item in the budget for each of these medical discovery teams that the legislators created back in 2015. I think that's probably at risk now. We were called, each of us from the discovery teams, to go testify and justify why we needed funding. So yes, I did. A couple of times we've reported back to the legislators on our progress and success, and then very recently just had to update that. I'm happy to say every single one of the medical discovery teams has brought a lot of money into the state. I think it has been a very wise investment. And I hope it continues, certainly.
Yeah. Would you be able to send the slides that you used today?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Who can I send them to?
You can, I'll send you an email and you can reply and send them
Okay.
to me, that would be great.
Absolutely. I share these slides with everybody because I'm trying to get the word out and spread the word because it's
Yeah,
a big deal,
those slides are shocking.
right?
Well, this has
Yeah.
been very informative. Thank you for taking the time. This is very helpful.
My pleasure. Thank you for your time. I'm very grateful. And holler if I can ever do anything. Okay?
We
Okay.
Yeah, really
appreciate your
appreciate your
work.
work.
Thank you. Thanks. Take care.
Have a
Bye-bye.
great day.
Bye.
You
Bye
too.
now.